Usually when we think about driving a car, there's this expectation of just absolute transparency from the machine, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Like you look at the dashboard and if the engine is overheating or, I don't know, the oil pressure drops, a little red light flips on. The entire system is engineered to warn you, to basically save the vehicle from a catastrophic failure before you just, blow a gasket halfway across the country.
It's a diagnostic tool rooted in self-preservation.
Hmm.
You inherently trust the warning system to tell you the objective truth because, well, its only purpose is to keep the whole operation moving safely.
Exactly. But I want you to imagine for a second that you take your car to a mechanic for a routine checkup, and instead of fixing the engine, the mechanic reaches under the dashboard and just unplugs the warning light.
Wow.
And why? Because that same mechanic happens to own the local tow truck company. He gets a massive, lucrative payout every single time a car breaks down on the highway and needs to be dragged back to his shop. Suddenly, the system isn't designed to keep you safe on the road anymore. It is quite literally designed to drive you into a ditch.
Wow. That is a phenomenal, if deeply unsettling way to set the stage for what we're looking at today. Because, when we transition from automotive repair to the absolute highest echelons of global statecraft and military strategy, we start dealing with systems that are infinitely more complex. But perhaps suffering from an eerily similar misalignment of incentives, the mechanics of the state might actually be unplugging the warning lights on purpose.
And that's exactly why you were here with us for this deep dive. Because we know you're constantly bombarded with just chaotic news, right? Endless updates about global conflicts, sudden economic instability, shifting geopolitical tension.
It's exhausting.
It is. And you're likely looking for a way to cut through that deafening noise without feeling completely overwhelmed by just, the sheer volume of information. So today we are opening up a really fascinating, highly provocative piece of source material that attempts to explain the absolute root of all that noise.
We are dissecting the transcript of a recent, highly in-depth interview from Glenn Deason's channel. And his guest was Karen Kwiatkowski, a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel.
Right.
She spent 20 years in the military, worked deep inside the Pentagon, and also spent considerable time at the NSA, the National Security Agency. And crucially, she was fundamentally a consumer of military intelligence at the absolute highest levels.
Which is key here.
Exactly. She wasn't just observing from the outside. She was in the actual rooms where this data was being processed.
And the mission of this deep dive, the real so what for you listening right now, is to thoroughly unpack her core thesis. Kwiatkowski is arguing that the U.S. military-industrial complex and the overarching foreign policy establishment are essentially driving the country, and by extension, the entire world, right, toward an inevitable mathematical and systemic crash.
Yeah, she doesn't mince words.
No, she doesn't. And we need to explore this because if her analysis holds any weight, we aren't just having some, abstract debate about foreign policy in a distant Washington think tank. This is about the structural integrity of the global economy.
Right. The actual purchasing power of the dollar in your wallet.
Exactly. The very real day-to-day realities of American life.
It's a macro-level theory of systemic failure that directly connects the battlefields of Eastern Europe and the Middle East to the grocery store aisles in the Midwest.
Now, before we go any further, we do have to issue a very clear, very critical disclaimer here.
Yes, very important.
This source material contains some incredibly charged, highly contentious political opinions. It touches on the U.S. government, the military, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, NATO, the war in Ukraine, Iran, Israel, all the third rail.
All of them, yeah.
So it is absolutely crucial for us to state firmly right out of the gate that neither of us here is endorsing, validating, or taking sides on any of these viewpoints. We are not here to champion a left-wing perspective or a right-wing perspective.
Not at all.
Our sole goal today is to impartially report, analyze, and explore the ideas contained within this specific interview transcript so that you can fully understand the author's arguments and, evaluate them for yourself.
Right. We're acting purely as an analytical lens. We're focusing the light on the arguments she presents, breaking down the underlying mechanics of what she's claiming, and really just examining how she connects these historical dots, regardless of how provocative or, frankly, controversial those claims might be.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start at the absolute foundation of how decisions are made, or rather how we think they're made, because there's this this high school civics class version of foreign policy, right?
Right.
And then there's what Kwiatkowski claims she saw firsthand operating in the halls of the Pentagon. So let's break down the illusion versus the alleged reality here.
Yeah, so the common assumption, the civics class version, as you put it, is this linear, highly logical progression. You have these vast intelligence agencies, right? The CIA, the NSA, various branches of military intelligence.
Right, the alphabet soup.
Exactly. And they act as neutral fact gatherers. Their mandate is to collect raw data about the world, compile it into objective, unbiased assessments, and present those assessments to policymakers.
Sounds great on paper.
It does. And then the policymakers, whether they're in the White House or Congress, they take that ground truth and use it to make rational, defensive decisions in the best interest of the nation.
Right, it's supposed to work like a doctor looking at an MRI before deciding on surgery, you know. You don't cut until you know what the scan says. But Kwiatkowski argues that the reality is entirely backward.
Completely backward, yeah.
She describes her time being stationed at the Pentagon around 2002 and 2003, which is right in the crucial run-up to the invasion of Iraq. She wasn't an intelligence producer. She was a consumer of these highly classified intelligence products. And she claims that intelligence is not used to inform wise decisions. Instead, it's treated like a menu at a restaurant.
The menu metaphor it's doing a lot of heavy lifting here, and we really need to understand the mechanics of why. She argues that political appointees and top-level policymakers already know exactly what they want to do before they ever sit down to look at the intel.
They already placed their order, basically.
Yeah. Exactly. They have pre-existing ideological goals or goals driven by their alliances and financial backers. So they look at the vast, complex, often contradictory output of the entire intelligence community, and they simply cherry-pick the specific data points that support their predetermined agenda.
Wow.
Yeah, they toss out everything else, and they use those selected pieces of intelligence as a stamp of authority.
I want to pause here because she explicitly mentions an entity called the Office of Special Plans operating at that time. And she watched them take intelligence that was known to be untrue or had already been deeply discounted by other agencies. But because it had a top secret stamp on it, they could weave it into a brand new narrative to sell the Iraq War.
Right.
For those who don't remember the granular details of 2002, what exactly was the Office of Special Plans?
So the Office of Special Plans, or the OSP, was a Pentagon unit created under then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz.
Yeah.
It was led by Douglas Faith. And its fundamental purpose, crucially, was to bypass the traditional intelligence filters of the CIA.
Wait, bypass the CIA?
Yes, because the CIA was telling the administration that the evidence linking Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda, or the evidence of active weapons of mass destruction, was spotty, unverified, or outright fabricated.
The warning lights were flashing.
Exactly. The warning lights were on. But the administration didn't like that answer. So the OSP was set up to essentially sift through the raw, unvetted intelligence, like the rumors, the unverified defector claims, and package it into official-looking reports that supported the invasion. Kwiatkowski was sitting there watching this happen, watching discarded intelligence be resurrected just to justify a policy that had already been decided upon.
Okay, I have to throw some pushback at this, just conceptually, because it challenges the entire premise of our institutional guardrails, right? I mean, isn't the intelligence community fundamentally designed with overlapping checks and balances specifically to prevent this kind of ideological capture?
You would think so, yeah.
Because it sounds to me like a CEO who hires a ridiculously expensive, prestigious consulting firm, not to actually find the best business strategy, but just so they can print a glossy, spiral-bound report that validates a terrible corporate acquisition the CEO already promised his golf buddy they were going to make.
That analogy captures the exact dynamic she's describing. The intelligence isn't the map guiding the journey. It is the marketing brochure used to sell the trip to the shareholders, which in this case is the public and Congress.
Right.
And if we look at the why behind this, it operates on a couple of intersecting levels. On a psychological level, it's basic human nature, right? It's confirmation bias. People naturally seek out information that validates what they already believe.
Sure, we all do that.
But Kwiatkowski elevates this to a state level, where it's not just about psychological comfort, but ideology and sheer financial return driving the bias. In her interview, she actually draws a direct parallel to academia.
Oh, how so?
Well, imagine a researcher who has built their entire career on a specific thesis. When they conduct a new study, there's immense pressure to discard the data that contradicts their life's work and only publish the data that supports it, just to secure their next grant.
Ah, I see. But the stakes here aren't a published paper in a niche academic journal. The stakes are trillions of dollars, global stability, and millions of lives. And she claims this operates like her phrase is a huge favor machine. I really
Yes.
want to dig into that specific phrase. She views the government as an entity that exists primarily to reallocate common resources, taxpayer money, to donors, friends, and special interest groups. She explicitly names AI PAC in the text, alongside broader corporate donors and foreign alliances.
Right. We should clarify that.
Yeah, we throw acronyms around a lot in foreign policy. So, AIPAC is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, a highly influential lobbying group that advocates for pro-Israel policies to the legislative and executive branches of the U.S. Kwiatkowski is basically stating that if a group like that, or, a massive defense contractor, buys political influence, they expect a tangible return on that investment. And war, in her view, is the ultimate resource reallocation event.
It is, because war mobilizes unparalleled, almost incomprehensible amounts of capital. Think about the mechanics of lobbying. It isn't just someone handing a politician a bag of cash in a dark alley.
Right, it's institutionalized.
Exactly, it's a structural loop. A defense contractor or a political action committee donates heavily to a candidate's campaign. That candidate gets elected, sits on the Armed Services Committee, and they vote to approve a massive weapons package or a foreign aid bill that directly benefits the contractor or the allied nation.
And then what happens?
Then, when that politician or the military generals involved retire, they get hired onto the board of directors of that very same defense contractor for a seven-figure salary. This is what she means by a favor machine. It is a closed, self-sustaining loop. She is arguing that this isn't about traditional defense, where a nation studies a legitimate threat to efficiently protect its limited resources. She claims the U.S. is engaged in perpetual, expeditionary offense simply to keep this economic engine running.
And this cherry-picking process to justify those offenses isn't isolated to a single administration or a single political party. Kwiatkowski points out that to sell these manufactured narratives, officials will strategically leak this curated, cherry-picked intelligence to major media outlets. She specifically calls out Axios, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times.
The mechanism of the leak is crucial here. Let's say you have an administration that wants to escalate tensions in a specific region, but the public isn't on board.
Okay.
Yeah. An anonymous senior intelligence official will leak a highly classified but heavily stripped down and curated memo to a prominent journalist at, say, the New York Times. The journalist, eager for a scoop, publishes it.
And she mentions both the Trump and Biden administrations utilizing this exact method. It is a systemic feature, not a bug tied to one specific president's style.
That's not.
So the media reports the leaked, cherry-picked intelligence as breaking objective news, like intelligence reveals new threat. The public absorbs it as objective truth, and then the policymaker, the one who leaked it in the first place, goes on television and points to the New York Times article as independent proof that they need to enact the ideological goal they wanted all along.
It creates a perfect closed loop of validation. The policymaker wants an intervention. They find a single thread of intel to justify it. They leak that thread to the press publishes it, and then the policymaker uses the press coverage to manufacture public consent.
It's brilliant in a really dark way.
It is. Because the original context of the intelligence, all the caveats, the dissenting opinions from the CIA, the unreliability of the source, is entirely washed away in the process.
Wow. This brings us to a massive structural question, though. If intelligence is merely a rubber stamp for predetermined goals, what exactly are those goals? We've talked deeply about the process of how decisions are made and how the public is managed, but now we need to transition to the actual targets of that process over the last 20 years. Like, what is the grand strategy if it isn't just defensive? In the interview, Kwiatkowski outlines a multi-decade march across the Middle East.
Yeah. And to illustrate this, the transcript brings up a very famous and frankly very controversial historical anecdote involving General Wesley Clark.
Oh, this is a staggering story for those who haven't heard it. General Wesley Clark was the former Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO. Around 2006 or 2007, a few years after he retired, he went on television and exposed what he claimed was a highly classified memo from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He said he was shown this memo shortly after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. This document supposedly outlined a 5-year plan to take down 7 countries. It wasn't about finding bin Laden, it was a literal hit list for systemic regime change.
7 countries in 5 years.
The list was Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off, like, the grand finale with Iran.
And according to Kwiatkowski's analysis, if you look at the geopolitical history of the last 2 decades, we have watched the U.S. foreign policy establishment systematically work its way down that exact list.
That's eerie.
It is. Now, they didn't always use the exact same methods. It wasn't just outright military invasion like we saw in Iraq every time. They utilized a spectrum of interventions: economic pressure, crippling sanctions, proxy funding of rebel groups like we saw in Syria, and what she refers to as color revolutions.
Right, let's define color revolutions, because that term gets thrown around a lot in geopolitical circles but rarely explained. What is the actual mechanic of a color revolution?
Well, a color revolution is a term originally used to describe a series of nonviolent protests and regime changes that occurred in post-Soviet societies, but the term is broadened out. When Kwiatkowski uses it here, she is referring to the allegation that U.S. intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA, alongside various Western-funded non-governmental organizations, NGOs, actively orchestrate and fund domestic uprisings in foreign countries.
To overthrow governments that are hostile to U.S. interests.
Exactly. The mechanics involve funding student groups, training protest leaders, manipulating local media, and providing secure communications, all to create the appearance of a spontaneous democratic uprising, when in reality, it's a strategically funded coup designed to install a pro-Western leader.
Okay, so whether it's by invasion, proxy war, or color revolution, she argues the goal was always the same. Check off the names on that Wesley Clark list. But that brings up a really poignant question one she raises in the interview. If Iran was always on the list, if they were the ultimate prize at the end of the road, why were they saved for last? Why did the U.S. hesitate for 20 years?
The answer she provides is grounded in sheer logistical, geographic, and demographic reality. Iran is not Libya, and it certainly isn't 2003 Iraq.
Not at all.
First of all, it is a massive nation of roughly 93 million people. It has a formidable, deeply entrenched history as a civilization, highly challenging mountainous geography that makes a ground invasion just a logistical nightmare, and very strong, capable regional allies.
It's a fortress, basically.
Exactly. But more importantly, Kwiatkowski reveals something fascinating from her time inside. She states that for decades, perhaps 35 years or more, the U.S. military has been running endless war games and tabletop exercises trying to figure out how to successfully invade, blockade, or collapse Iran.
Like putting all the smartest military minds in a room, giving them unlimited theoretical resources, and telling them to game out a war with Iran. And what was the result of those war games?
She states unequivocally that in no case did the U.S. prevail. Never. In all those decades of paper planning, computer simulation, and strategic modeling, the military could never come up with a set of operational ideas that would actually work to bring Iran to its knees without causing catastrophic blowback to the U.S. and its allies. The intelligence analysts and the operational planners knew this as an objective fact. The math simply did not support a victory.
But this loops right back to the very first point we unpacked. The intelligence said, do not do this, it will not work, we cannot win. But because the ideological goal was already set, because Iran was the final name on the list, the warnings were ignored.
Right. Unplugging the warning light again.
Yeah, exactly. The source specifically points out that during the Trump administration, despite all these decades of war game failures, the U.S. engaged with Iran anyway. Most notably with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and the subsequent Iranian missile strikes on U.S. bases. She describes a culture of massive hubris, where civilian leaders simply do not care what the pessimistic intelligence says, preferring to listen to, can-do military planners who promise the moon but have absolutely no backup plan when reality hits.
If we pull back and look at the broader mechanics of this, we are looking at the concept of hegemony, right? And how ultimate, unchecked power can actually become a profound systemic vulnerability.
Like so.
Well, in political realism, states seek hegemony, total dominance over their region or the globe because they assume it provides ultimate security. No one can challenge you. But as Kwiatkowski explores, hegemony is a curse. When a state becomes all-powerful, the internal balance of power vanishes. War hawks become elevated within the bureaucratic system because there is no competing power strong enough to tell them no.
I see.
The state begins to assume it can absorb infinite financial costs and infinite strategic mistakes without ever having to prioritize its resources.
They start believing their own marketing brochures. They think they are immune to the laws of physics, logistics, and economics. But I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because if you ask the average American about U.S. military capability, they aren't going to think of failure. They'll say, hold on, didn't the U.S. definitively win the first Gulf War? Wasn't Operation Desert Storm in 1991 a masterpiece of military strategy that proved U.S. supremacy?
It's the most common counter-argument, yeah. And Kwiatkowski addresses it head-on in the interview. She acknowledges that General Norman Schwarzkopf received immense historic credit for his planning and execution of Desert Storm. However, she severely qualifies that win.
Qualifies it how?
She argues that Schwarzkopf fought what was essentially a fourth-rate army. Yes, Iraq had a large standing army, but they had effectively no navy and no air force to challenge American dominance in the skies. Furthermore, the U.S. had a massive international coalition, unlimited funding, and endless time to build up their forces in Saudi Arabia and prepare for every single scenario.
Okay, so to use another analogy, that is like a heavyweight UFC fighter spending 6 months in a billion-dollar training camp and then boasting about knocking out a guy who weighs 110 pounds and has never taken a boxing class.
Exactly.
It wasn't a fair fight, but she argues that Desert Storm injected a toxic, false sense of invincibility into the American military establishment. They thought every war would be exactly like that. 6 weeks of bombing, 100 hours of ground combat, and a ticker tape parade.
And that false invincibility is what led them to eventually push up against real, capable adversaries, which is where Kwiatkowski claims the curtain was finally pulled back on the Wizard of Oz. Because when a real adversary like Iran or Iranian-backed militias like the Houthis pushed back, massive military weaknesses were instantly exposed.
Right.
She gives some staggering tactical details to illustrate this. In recent conflicts, particularly in the Red Sea and the Middle East, the U.S. was reportedly firing highly advanced interceptor missiles that cost upwards of $500,000 or maybe $100,000 at the very least, just to shoot down incoming enemy drones that cost maybe $15,000 to assemble.
$500,000 to shoot down a $15,000 drone. That is like trying to kill a swarm of aggressive mosquitoes using a diamond-encrusted shotgun. Yes, you might kill the mosquito, but you are going to go bankrupt buying the ammunition. The math on that is apocalyptic for a military budget. If you're spending $500,000 to neutralize a $20,000 threat, and the enemy has hundreds of thousands of those cheap, mass-produced threats rolling off assembly lines, you are going to lose the war of attrition long before you ever win the kinetic war. You simply run out of money and missiles.
It gets even more surreal when you look at how the military leadership reacted to this math problem. In the interview, she mentions a specific anecdote about CENTCOM.
Right, United States Central Command.
Correct. The Unified Combatant Command responsible for U.S. military operations in the Middle East. According to Kwiatkowski, after things started escalating in the region recently and the traditional highly expensive defense plans weren't working against these cheap drone swarms, CENTCOM's commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, allegedly had an email sent out to the troops in the theater.
Wait, an email to the troops?
Yes. The email was asking the rank-and-file soldiers for creative ideas on what to do next.
They're kidding.
I'm not. She is utterly floored by this in the transcript, and honestly, so am I. The top brass, the generals and admirals who make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, who oversee trillion-dollar budgets, who are supposed to have meticulously planned for every conceivable contingency. They are basically crowdsourcing military strategy from 20-year-old soldiers sitting in bunkers because they literally have no plan B.
That is insane. It highlights a staggering fundamental disconnect between the political ambition to wage war and the operational reality of executing it. The entire system is designed around the assumption that the enemy will be overwhelmed by our technology and simply fold. There is no structural contingency for an enemy that unifies, absorbs the initial high-tech blow, and effectively fights back using cheap asymmetric warfare, which just stretches the massive U.S. logistics tail to its absolute breaking point.
What's fascinating here is it forces us to ask the most critical question, why? Why is the most well-funded, technologically advanced military in the history of human civilization using $500,000 missiles to shoot down $15,000 drones?
Right. If cheap drones are the future of warfare, why doesn't the Pentagon just build their own cheap, effective drones?
To answer that, Kwiatkowski takes us away from the battlefield, out of the Middle East, and drops us right into the corporate boardroom. We have to look at the granular mechanics of how the military is actually funded.
Oh, boy. Okay, so we're shifting from military strategy to economic incentives. Because most people view waste in the Pentagon, the infamous inability to pass a financial audit, the missing billions of dollars, the $10,000 toilet seats, as a failure of administration, right? They think it's just bureaucratic incompetence.
Yes, But Kwiatkowski argues that it is actually the intended design of the system. The military acquisition system is not driven by the goal of producing effective, low-cost, reliable, deadly, and easy-to-maintain equipment. It is driven purely, 100%, by corporate profit and political ownership.
Let's break down how that actually functions on a bureaucratic level. Because it's profit over preparedness. She claims that if you produce a cheap, highly effective drone something made of commercial off-the-shelf parts that can be mass-produced easily and fixed by a teenager with a screwdriver, you don't make a massive bloated profit margin.
Right. The big five defense corporations,
Mm.
Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, they don't want to build a $10,000 solution. They want to build a high-value, incredibly exquisite, technologically complex item, like an F-35 fighter jet or a Patriot missile system.
Why?
Because those items come with a massive, endless logistics tail. The initial sale of the weapon is just the down payment. The perpetual money, the billions of dollars over decades, is made in the maintenance contracts, the proprietary replacement parts that only the original company can manufacture, the required software updates, the specialized training.
It's the subscription model applied to war.
Exactly. If you build a cheap drone that gets blown up and easily replaced, the revenue stream ends. If you build a complex system that constantly breaks down and requires a team of civilian contractors to maintain, you have secured a revenue stream for a generation.
She describes this relationship as a parasitic fusion between defense contractors and the Pentagon. It is a system where the military budgets, the actual requests for what the military needs to fight, are allegedly not written by Congress or even the executive branch. They are essentially drafted by the K Street lobbyists and the very contractors who are going to receive the money.
It's wild.
The contractors pitch the next best thing, a massive technological marvel that looks amazing in a computer rendering and secures jobs in key congressional districts, but is entirely unsuited for gritty, attritional, mud and blood warfare against a peer adversary.
And you might be asking, if the military is this blatantly inefficient, if it's this deeply captured by corporate interests, why hasn't anyone from the inside ever tried to fix it?
Right. Surely there are patriotic, highly intelligent generals who see this vulnerability and want to reform it. There have to be people in the Pentagon who realize that fighting a war of attrition with $500,000 missiles is national suicide.
Kwiatkowski addresses that exact thought by bringing up a specific historical example. Douglas MacGregor. In the 1980s and 90s, when MacGregor was a younger officer, a major, and then a colonel, he looked at how the Army was organized and realized it was structured for failure. It was too heavy, too slow, and reliant on these massive logistical tails we just discussed.
Okay, so what did he do?
He wrote extensive proposals and books for radical Army reorganization, trying to modernize the ground force to make it leaner, highly mobile, and more effective for future combat.
He was trying to build a modern military instead of a profitable one. And what happened when he presented these reforms?
According to Kwiatkowski, the establishment essentially patted him on the head. They told him his ideas are intellectually interesting, but they didn't fit into the existing highly profitable acquisition system. You couldn't sell a lean mobile force to the defense contractors.
Unbelievable.
And more importantly, his ideas didn't align with the promotion pipeline. The bureaucratic system protects itself like an immune response. If you propose reforms that threaten the financial flow of the contractors, or if you threaten the established hierarchy of generals who made their entire careers championing these expensive bloated systems, you are marginalized. You will not get your next star.
So inefficiency is heavily incentivized and rewarded.
Exactly. And efficiency and reform are actively punished.
It's a terrifyingly closed loop where objective reality is completely excluded. So we've seen how this profit-driven model operates in the Middle East, generating endless, unwinnable wars to justify endless corporate contracts. But Kwiatkowski's interview doesn't stop there. She argues this exact same corporate blueprint, this same drive for captive markets has been applied to Europe.
Yeah, we need to shift our focus to NATO and the current devastating conflict in Ukraine. In the interview, the source frames NATO not primarily as a defensive alliance meant to ensure European security, but as an appendage of U.S. foreign policy, and crucially, as a massive captive market for U.S. weapons manufacturers.
She calls it a bonanza. Let's look at the historical context of the 1990s. The Cold War ends, the Soviet Union collapses, and all these Eastern European countries are suddenly independent and opening up. The narrative from the military-industrial complex wasn't about building a lasting, inclusive peace architecture in Europe that included Russia. It was about viewing these newly independent nations, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, as a massive new frontier to sell expensive American weapons.
Right.
Because to join NATO, you have to achieve interoperability, which essentially means you have to buy Western, primarily American military gear.
And this rapid expansion of NATO eastward wasn't done blindly. It wasn't an innocent mistake. The transcript explicitly points out that there were loud, desperate historical warnings from the most respected, experienced minds in American diplomacy. We're talking about George Kennan, the legendary diplomat who was the literal architect of the U.S. Cold War containment policy against the Soviet Union.
A heavy hitter.
The heaviest. Kennan argued vehemently in the late 90s that expanding NATO eastward would be a tragic, historic mistake that would eventually trigger a nationalist, militaristic Russian backlash.
And it wasn't just Kennan, right? William Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia and is now the current director of the CIA, warned all the way up through 2008 that trying to pull Ukraine into the West's orbit, specifically offering them NATO membership, was the brightest of all red lines for Moscow. Burns warned that it would inevitably lead to civil war in Ukraine and force a reluctant but violent Russian intervention.
They knew the risks. The intelligence community and the diplomatic corps understood the immense existential danger of pushing that boundary. But again, just like with the war games in Iran, the intelligence and the diplomatic warnings were completely ignored because the ideological and financial goals were already locked in.
Unplugging the warning light.
Once again, the Clinton administration and subsequent administrations, according to Kwiatkowski's analysis, simply assumed Russia was too weak, too economically broken in the 90s and 2000s to ever do anything about it. So they pushed ahead, prioritizing short-term expansion, political wins, and lucrative arms sales over long-term strategic stability.
The source goes further into the specific targeting of Ukraine, and this is where the geopolitical maneuvering becomes incredibly cynical. It wasn't just about placing missiles closer to Moscow, it was about treating Ukraine with a sort of neo-colonial mindset.
How so?
Well, the West eyed Ukraine for its vast agricultural and mineral resources, its highly educated but cheap labor force, and its massive, expansive landmass, which could be used for large-scale military exercises and bases.
Right. Kwiatkowski compares it to how the U.S. previously utilized places like Czechoslovakia and Germany during the Cold War for massive war games and forward staging. But as those countries became fully integrated into the European Union, their populations became wealthier and less willing to host massive foreign military footprints. They started to say no.
They didn't want tanks driving through their fields anymore.
Exactly. So the U.S. military machine needed a new, compliant frontier, a massive piece of geography where they could operate with impunity, and Ukraine fit the bill perfectly.
Okay, I want to highlight something from the interview here, because here's where it gets really interesting and honestly incredibly dark. The host of the interview, Glenn Deason, brings up a specific article written by the billionaire investor and philanthropist George Soros back in 1993.
1993, over 30 years ago.
In this article, Soros allegedly outlined a potential future structure for a new global security order. He suggested that Western nations, particularly the United States, have developed a deep, fundamental political aversion to their own soldiers coming home in body bags. The Western public will no longer tolerate mass casualties of their own citizens for foreign interventions.
Which is true. The political cost is too high.
Right. So the proposed solution to maintain Western dominance was a partnership. NATO and the West provide the advanced military technology, the intelligence, and the funding, while Eastern Europe provides the meat, the manpower to actually fight and die on the ground.
The sheer calculated cynicism of that concept is staggering. It effectively turns Eastern European populations into mercenary proxies for Western interests. They bleed, their cities burn, so the West doesn't have to face the domestic political fallout of a military draft or thousands of grieving mothers on the evening news. And Kwiatkowski argues that this 1993 blueprint is not just a theory. It is exactly what we are witnessing unfold in Ukraine today.
It perfectly aligns with the claims she makes about the events of 2022, right as the Russian invasion began. The text points to acknowledgments that Moscow reached out in the very early days, perhaps even hours, of the invasion, offering terms for a neutral Ukraine. It mentions President Zelensky's own comments in an interview with The Economist, where he noted that certain Western countries actually preferred a long, drawn-out war to systematically bleed and weaken Russia economically and militarily, even if it meant the utter destruction of Ukraine in the process.
And most notably, the interview references the peace talks that occurred in Istanbul in the spring of 2022, just weeks into the war. The source claims that a tentative peace framework was reached between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators, but those talks were intentionally blown up and abandoned because of direct pressure from the West.
Wow.
The text specifically mentions the U.S. and then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson flying to Kyiv, essentially demanding that Ukraine reject the peace deal and return to the fight, promising endless Western backing.
They demanded Ukraine fight a proxy war that they were never mathematically equipped to win outright against a much larger neighbor. The transcript emphasizes the devastating demographic and cultural destruction of Ukraine as a direct result of this decision to prolong the war. We're talking about millions of people displaced, a generation of men lost to casualties, and the infrastructure of a nation leveled.
It's a tragedy.
It is. And yet, the source notes a perverse, almost Orwellian reality in the West. The supposedly pro-Ukrainian stance mandated by Western media and politicians requires citizens to actively ignore the reality on the ground. You have to ignore the videos of massive, violent, forced conscriptions happening on the streets of Kyiv. You have to look away from the staggering, horrific casualty numbers, and you have to dismiss any reporting of this grim reality as mere enemy propaganda.
It is a meticulously manufactured narrative designed to keep the funding flowing. And the financial angle, the military-industrial complex, rears its head again here in a major way. Kwiatkowski claims that the early stages of the Ukraine war were used by the U.S. and European militaries as a convenient excuse to completely dump all their old, outdated weapon stocks.
Just clearing out the garage.
Exactly. They cleared out their warehouses of gear that was destined for the scrap heap anyway, sent that obsolete equipment to Ukraine, and then used the resulting inventory deficit to justify going to their respective governments for massive, multi-billion-dollar contracts to buy brand-new, top-of-the-line inventory for themselves.
It was a generational money grab disguised as a moral crusade. The defense contractors get paid to build the new weapons for the U.S., and the old weapons get blown up in Eastern Europe.
This brings us to a critical juncture in Kwiatkowski's overall argument. We have exhaustively examined the deliberate failures of intelligence, the exposure of military weakness abroad when faced with real opposition, and the cynical profit motives driving these endless proxy wars. But there's a limit to this system. What happens when the bill for all of this finally comes due at home?
Right.
This leads us away from foreign policy and directly into the systemic economic reality of the United States.
Because you cannot run a global empire on a credit card forever. The laws of economics eventually catch up. The source transitions from foreign battlefields to the domestic precipice, and the numbers she lays out are absolutely terrifying. The U.S. national debt is currently sitting at roughly $30 trillion. And it's not just sitting there statically, it is accelerating, growing at a rate of about $2 trillion every single year.
$2 trillion a year.
Kwiatkowski states plainly that this debt is mathematically unpayable. There is no combination of tax hikes or spending cuts that can actually pay down $40 trillion.
To put the severity of that in perspective, she notes that the interest payments alone on this national debt now exceed the entire bloated budget of the Pentagon.
Wait, just the interest?
Just the interest. Let's think about the mechanics of that. The government is now borrowing trillions of dollars just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed to fund the wars we just spent the last 30 minutes discussing. In macroeconomics, this is the textbook. Unavoidable buildup to a sovereign debt crisis.
Let's explain the mechanics of a sovereign debt crisis, because it sounds like economic jargon, but it's probably the most important concept in this entire deep dive. How does a country actually go bankrupt when it can print its own money?
So a sovereign debt crisis occurs when a country is no longer able to pay its bills or when investors lose faith in its ability to repay its debt. The U.S. funds its deficit by issuing treasury bonds. Foreign nations, pension funds, and investors buy these bonds because they are considered the safest investment in the world.
Because they're backed by the U.S. government.
Exactly. But if the debt gets so high that investors start to worry the U.S. might default, or if they worry the U.S. will just print endless amounts of money to pay the debt, which causes massive inflation and devalues the currency, they will stop buying the bonds, or they will demand much higher interest rates to compensate for the risk.
And if they stop buying?
If foreign buyers stop purchasing treasuries, or if the interest rates skyrocket, the U.S. government suddenly cannot finance its daily operations. The spending machine stops overnight.
And here is where Kwiatkowski draws a truly chilling historical parallel. She looks at the modern United States with its military overreach and its unpayable debt. and compares it directly to the Soviet Union in the late 1960s and 1970s, right before its collapse.
It is a profound and unsettling comparison. She isn't talking about communism versus capitalism here. She is talking about the life cycle of a massive imperial state bureaucracy. The late Soviet Union was sclerotic, deeply corrupt, and hopelessly inefficient. It lied to its citizens about everything the state was doing, from the economy to the disaster in Afghanistan. And crucially, it was led by a parade of aging, declining figures, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, who were essentially just figureheads for a system running entirely on bureaucratic autopilot.
And she explicitly calls out Joe Biden in this context, portraying him as a modern parallel, a figurehead exhibiting age-related decline, yet the system just humors him and keeps chugging along. The bureaucracy doesn't actually need a dynamic, functioning executive. It just needs the momentum of the machine to keep the contracts flowing. The elite in this system retain all their wealth, power, and privileges, while the underlying economic and social infrastructure completely rots from the inside out.
But there's a crucial difference between a Soviet collapse and a potential U.S. collapse.
Yeah.
And it's a point we have to add to understand the global stakes. When the Soviet Union fell, it was largely isolated economically. It was a tragedy for its citizens, but the global capitalist economy kept humming along.
The U.S. is different.
Very different. The United States is the central pillar of the global financial system. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. If the U.S. experiences a sovereign debt crisis, it isn't isolated. It is deeply intertwined with every market on Earth. A U.S. financial collapse is everybody's problem. It would trigger a global depression.
The interviewer, Glenn Deason, brings up a point made by Senator Rand Paul, contrasting two potential outcomes for this scenario: a controlled landing versus a catastrophic crash. A controlled landing would require the U.S. leadership to consciously wake up, recognize its limits, drastically scale back its global empire, bring the troops home, and radically restructure its debt and spending in an orderly fashion.
But Kwiatkowski argues that a controlled landing is impossible, given the incentives we discussed earlier. The mechanics of the favor machine won't allow it. The K3 lobbyists won't allow the Pentagon budget to be cut. The politicians won't cut social programs because they will lose the next election. The air traffic controllers are screaming at the pilot that the plane is too heavy, and the pilot has intentionally turned the radio off.
A crash is coming.
A crash is coming.
And you might be listening to this thinking, okay, that sounds bad, but we're Americans. We're a resilient, innovative culture. If the economy takes a massive hit, if the dollar drops, we'll tighten our belts, we'll plant victory gardens like in World War II, and we'll figure it out.
A lot of people think that.
But Kwiatkowski makes a point that absolutely stopped me in my tracks regarding our actual modern level of resilience.
She details what she calls the 3 days of no trucks scenario. She argues that unlike the citizens of the Soviet Union, who were hardened by decades of deprivation and knew how to navigate black markets, or the citizens of Iran, who have spent 40 years building robust parallel economies to survive crippling Western sanctions, the modern American citizen is wildly, dangerously unprepared for logistical failure.
She points out that the vast majority of urban and suburban Americans live paycheck to paycheck, deeply reliant on a fragile, just-in-time supply chain. If the financial mechanisms freeze up because of a debt crisis, the trucks stop delivering goods to the cities. If the trucks stop, the grocery store shelves are completely empty in 72 hours.
72 hours.
And then what? She argues that half the country doesn't even know how to cook a meal from scratch using raw ingredients, let alone know how to grow their own food, preserve crops, or source fresh water. We don't have deep, resilient community networks anymore. We are highly atomized individuals, staring at our phones, utterly dependent on Amazon Prime, and a grocery store that is only 3 days away from starvation. I mean, I can barely keep my fridge stocked for a week.
And it's not just the $40 trillion in formal, on-the-books national debt that will trigger this. She brings up the estimated $250 trillion in unfunded liabilities.
$250 trillion?
Yes. These are the mathematical promises the government has made regarding Medicare, Social Security, and federal pensions for people currently alive. When the financial system crashes, those promises vanish into thin air. She's painting a picture of an incredibly fragile society that simply assumes tomorrow will always look exactly like today, completely blind to the mathematical impossibility of maintaining it.
This brings us to the final major theme of the source material. We've established the military failure, the economic inevitability of a crash, and the fragility of the population. As the state's financial insolvency and its military incompetence become increasingly obvious to the public, how does the government react? They don't apologize. They don't reform the system. They crack down.
Exactly. When the illusion of competence shatters and the public starts asking dangerous questions, the state turns to authoritarianism to protect its remaining power. The source claims we are seeing a massive, coordinated rise in censorship across the West, entirely aimed at silencing domestic dissent.
We see specific examples cited in the text of European nations sanctioning their own former military personnel. If a retired officer goes on a podcast or writes an article speaking out against the prevailing narrative regarding the war in Ukraine or the expansion of NATO, the state doesn't just debate them. They freeze their bank accounts, they restrict their ability to travel, and they essentially try to unperson them economically and socially to serve as a warning to anyone else thinking of speaking up.
The text highlights a very specific court case in the UK involving an academic named David Miller. In a surprising twist against this authoritarian trend, a British employment tribunal actually ruled that Miller's anti-Zionist philosophy, his belief that the state of Israel is inherently racist, was a protected philosophical belief under anti-discrimination laws, meaning he shouldn't have been fired for it.
Right.
The source uses this rare victory for free speech in the UK to contrast with the rhetorical sleight of hand happening in the United States.
Right. The interviewer points to American politicians, specifically naming Senator Marco Rubio, who allegedly use a very deliberate, calculated tactic to crush dissent. They rightfully state that a nation must protect its Jewish communities from genuine anti-Semitism and violence, a point literally everyone agrees on. But then, they immediately equate protecting Jewish people with legally banning any political criticism of the state of Israel's foreign policy or the U.S. funding of it. They conflate bigotry with legitimate geopolitical critique.
This raises an important question. It's the weaponization of language and the legal system to shield state-aligned projects from domestic critique. The state is essentially telling its citizens, do not point out the failures of our foreign alliances, do not question the wars we are funding with your tax dollars, or we will classify you as a bigot and a threat to society. But as Kwiatkowski points out, this heavy-handed censorial approach is ultimately backfiring.
How so?
It isn't making people believe the government. It is generating massive systemic cynicism among the populace.
It's that 1970s Soviet cynicism again. People look at the news, they look at the official statements from the Pentagon or the White House, and they automatically, reflexively assume the government is lying. And she makes a really profound point about political alienation across the spectrum. She notes that traditional, passionate voting blocs, whether it's the Manje crowd on the right, paleoconservatives, or libertarians, are becoming completely disillusioned with the democratic process.
Yeah, they vote for a populist politician who runs on a platform of America first, promising an end to foreign wars and a focus on domestic infrastructure. But the moment that politician takes office, they get dragged into the exact same military-industrial machinations as the last guy.
The voters realize they have zero actual control over the apparatus of the state. The favor machine operates regardless of who sits in the Oval Office.
If we connect this to the broader historical picture of how civilizations decline, this is how empires actually end. It is rarely a foreign army marching into the capital city and burning it down. It is the internal, silent loss of legitimacy. When a population completely loses faith in the moral goodness of their government, when they lose faith in the purchasing power of their currency, and when they see that the supposed mighty military power is a hollow shell, the social contract dissolves.
The empire collapses inward.
Exactly, under the crushing weight of its own apathy and cynicism. Why pay taxes? Why follow the law if the system is completely rigged?
But I want to pivot slightly as we wrap up, because the source doesn't end on pure, unadulterated doom and gloom. There is a fascinating, almost absurd little anecdote Kwiatkowski shares at the end of the interview that I want to highlight, because it shows how everyday people are reacting to this overbearing surveillance state. She talks about flock cameras.
Ah, yes.
These automated surveillance and license plate reader cameras that are popping up in communities all over the country, tracking everyone's movements.
Yes, the citizens aren't organizing armed rebellions or violent protests. They are engaging in a sort of joyful viral disobedience.
It's hilarious and profound at the same time.
Yeah.
People are actively vandalizing or taking down these surveillance cameras in their neighborhoods, and it has become a massive social media game. When someone gets arrested or questioned by the police for tampering with a camera, random people online flood the comment sections and police tip lines, providing fake alibis, saying, "No, he didn't touch that camera. He was having lunch with me at Applebee's."
It's amazing.
It's a lighthearted, deeply cynical, yet highly entertaining rebellion against the creeping surveillance state. It shows that the populace is waking up to the reality that the state is not their friend, and they are finding creative, decentralized, and humorous ways to mock and dismantle its tools of control.
It is a perfect illustration of Kwiatkowski's underlying libertarian viewpoint coming through at the very end of the interview. She sees the growing distrust of the state, the mocking of authority, not as a tragedy, but as a necessary, healthy awakening. The tragedy isn't that the government is losing control. The tragedy is simply that the population is so logistically unprepared for the harsh transition that will follow when the state inevitably defaults and those grocery store trucks stop running.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We have just taken a massive, incredibly dense journey through Kwiatkowski's worldview. We started by looking at the intelligence apparatus not as a noble search for truth, but as a cherry-picked menu designed to validate highly profitable ideological wars. We saw how that exact mechanism pushed the U.S. into disastrous engagements in the Middle East, exposing severe military vulnerabilities when faced with cheap, asymmetric drone warfare. We unpacked the bureaucratic mechanics of how the military-industrial complex is fundamentally designed to prioritize corporate profit and lobbying over actual combat preparedness.
We then traced that exact same profit-driven blueprint to the expansion of NATO and the tragic, grinding proxy conflict in Ukraine, highlighting the deliberate ignoring of decades of strategic warnings from our top diplomats. And finally, we followed the money home, staring down a mathematically unpayable $40 trillion debt precipice, comparing the modern United States to the decaying, cynical Soviet Union, and observing a public that is increasingly alienated, yet finding ways to actively mock the authoritarian overreach of a failing state.
The mission of this deep dive was to present this source's framework so you can evaluate the systems operating around you. Tomorrow, when you see a news headline about a massive new defense contract, or a leaked intelligence report warning of a new foreign threat, or a sudden painful spike in inflation at the grocery store, you now have a different, much more critical lens through which you can analyze why it might be happening, moving far beyond the official narrative. We ask you to take this framework, test it against reality, and see if the puzzle pieces fit.
And I want to leave you with a final lingering thought that builds directly on the implications of what we've discussed today. If Kwiatkowski is entirely correct, and a national financial collapse is mathematically inevitable, meaning the U.S. military machine eventually grinds to a complete halt purely from a lack of funding and a worthless currency, what happens to the global power vacuum?
Yeah.
Does the world naturally become more peaceful without a global hegemon forcing its will across the continents? Or do we enter a chaotic, highly dangerous era of regional powers violently scrambling and warring for the throne that the United States was forced to abandon?
A truly profound and terrifying question to mull over. It brings us right back to that mechanic unplugging the warning light. We know the engine is struggling, we know the incentives are deeply misaligned, and the only question left is what the landscape looks like when the tow truck finally arrives. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep your eyes on the dashboard, keep questioning the mechanics, and we will catch you next time.